He was 12 years old when his father was taken from him. It happened on a cold night in the mountains, when enemy soldiers crossed the river border and hit the camp without warning. His father, the king of the mountain clans, had been protecting a group of women and children when 3 arrows found him. By morning, he was gone. The boy's name was Arkan. He was not the biggest child in the camp. He was not the fastest. He did not have the sharpest sword arm or the loudest laugh. What he had was a stillness to him, a way of watching things that made older men uncomfortable, as if he could see past the surface of a situation and read something underneath that they had missed. After his father's passing, the enemy kingdoms sent messengers with gifts of food and fine cloth. The gifts were not kindness. They were a message. They meant, your leader is gone, your people are weak, and we are watching. Arkan received the gifts quietly. He thanked the messengers politely. Then he gave every item to the oldest families in the camp and said nothing more. He was 12 years old, and he was already learning something important. Power was not always loud. Sometimes it was the silence that followed a careful decision. 2 years passed. The enemy kingdoms forgot about him, as powerful people often forget about young ones they do not consider a threat. That was their first mistake. At 14, Arkan walked alone into the territory of the Vorn clan, one of the 3 enemy groups responsible for the night his father was taken. He carried no army with him. He carried no flag of war. He went alone, in simple traveling clothes, with nothing on him except a small knife used for cutting bread. 3 days later, he came back. He carried his father's sword with him, the one that had been taken as a trophy that night 2 years ago. He also carried 3 enemy swords, each one belonging to a captain who had agreed, after a long conversation that no one else witnessed, to hand them over willingly. Nobody in his camp understood what had happened. Nobody in the Vorn clan spoke of it publicly, but the 3 captains who handed over their swords were seen by their own soldiers walking differently afterward, as if they had looked into something they were not ready for. Arkan never explained himself. He simply cleaned his father's sword, placed it above the fire, and went to sleep. When Arkan was 16, a long drought came to the mountain region. The rivers dropped, the grass turned to dust, animals moved east, and the clans that depended on them went hungry. There were 11 clans living in the mountain range at that time. They had never trusted each other. They had fought over water rights and grazing land for 3 generations. Old grudges sat between them like stones in the road. Everyone knew they were there, and everyone stepped around them rather than moving them. Arkan called a meeting. The clan leaders laughed when the invitation arrived. A 16-year-old boy, son of a dead king, calling a meeting of elders? Some of them came just to see what he would say. They expected him to be nervous, or proud, or foolish. What they found instead was a young man who sat at the head of the table, looked at each of them for a long moment before speaking, and then laid out a water-sharing plan so clear and fair that no one could find a reason to argue against it. One elder tried. He was a large man with a loud voice and a long history of taking more than his share of everything. He stood up and began to speak against the plan, raising his voice the way men do when they want to fill a room with noise instead of reason. Arkan looked at him. He did not shout. He did not stand. He simply turned his full attention to the man and made a sound. Not a roar yet, not even close, just a low, steady vibration at the bottom of his voice, and the elder stopped speaking. He sat down. He was not sure why. He told his son about it that evening and said, "It was like the mountain itself asked me to be quiet." The water plan was accepted. That year, no clan in the mountain range went without water, and for the first time in 3 generations, 11 clans shared a table without drawing knives. 5 years later, Arkan was 21. He had grown taller and quieter in equal measure. He ran his people's affairs with patience. He trained with his soldiers every morning, not to show authority, but because he believed a leader should never ask others to do what he himself was not willing to do. The night of the first true roar came without warning. A report came in the early evening that 3,000 enemy soldiers were moving toward a shepherd village in the eastern valley. Arkan's main force was a full day's ride away. His scouts had made a serious error in reading the enemy's direction of travel. By the time anyone realized what was happening, there was no time to send for reinforcements. Arkan rode alone. He arrived at the valley just before midnight. The enemy soldiers had formed a wide circle around the village. Their torches made the darkness look like a ring of fire. 3,000 trained men, standing in organized lines, following orders from an experienced commander who had spent 30 years winning every fight he entered. Arkhan rode to the front of the enemy line and stopped. The commander rode forward to meet him. He looked at the young man alone on his horse. No army, no weapons raised, no flag, and felt something unusual stir inside his chest. He pushed the feeling down. He was a professional. He had faced dangerous men before. "You have one man with you," the commander said, "and we have 3,000. I suggest you ride back the way you came." Arkhan looked at him for a moment without answering. Then he looked at the ring of soldiers. Then he looked up at the mountain ridges on either side of the valley. The loose stone formations that had been crumbling slowly for decades, held in place by nothing more than age and gravity. Then he took a breath so deep, it seemed to pull air from the entire valley, and he roared. Soldiers who were there that night described it differently, depending on where they were standing. Those closest to him said it was like being hit by a wave of sound that went through the body instead of around it. Those on the far edge of the formation said they heard it arrive a half-second after the men in front of them flinched, which meant the sound had traveled across 3,000 men like a wave moves across still water. 3 horses threw their riders instantly. 2 torches went out, though the night was completely still. A section of loose rock on the northern ridge, a formation that geographers later estimated weighed close to 40 tons, cracked along a fault line and slid down the mountainside with a sound like the earth clearing its throat. The commander's own torch went out in his hand. He stared at the young man on the horse. The young man had not moved. He sat exactly as he had sat before, straight, calm, his hands loose on the reins, as if what had just happened was as normal to him as breathing. The commander gave the order to hold, then to withdraw, then to full retreat. He never publicly explained his decision. In his private journal, discovered 200 years later in a royal archive, he wrote 3 words: "Do not return." The shepherd village was untouched. By morning, Arkhan's soldiers arrived to find him sitting outside the village, drinking tea with the shepherd families, asking about their goats. Stories travel faster than soldiers. Within 1 month, 5 kingdoms had heard about the night a single man turned back 3,000 troops without raising a weapon. The stories grew with each telling, as stories always do. Some said the mountain had actually spoken. Some said the man himself had turned into something older and larger than human for a moment. Some said the ground had split open at his feet. Arkhan heard the stories. He did not correct them. He also did not encourage them. He simply continued doing what he had always done, managing his people, training with his soldiers, solving small problems before they became large ones. The 7 enemy kingdoms met in private. Their kings and generals sat around a table and discussed a problem that was getting harder to ignore. Arkhan was uniting the mountain clans. One by one, through agreements and shared resources, and the quiet force of his leadership, 11 clans were becoming something that looked dangerously like a single nation. A united mountain alliance would control every major trade pass in the region. It would have access to fresh water sources that the lowland kingdoms depended on. It would be able to close roads, reroute rivers, and hold the high ground against any army that tried to advance through the passes. This could not be allowed to happen. The 7 kingdoms agreed to act together. They chose the Valley of Bones, a wide, flat plain between 2 mountain ranges, as the location for a show of combined force. Their armies together numbered over 100,000 soldiers. They believed that when Arkhan saw this number, he would accept their terms without a fight. The terms were simple: remain a collection of separate clans, pay annual tribute, and do not expand. They sent a messenger with the details of the meeting and the threat that came with it. Arkhan read the message. He thanked the messenger. He gave the messenger food for the road. Then he called his 10,000 soldiers together and told them they were marching to the Valley of Bones. When the coalition generals saw the mountain army arrive, some of them felt genuine relief. 10,000 against 100,000. The numbers made what was about to happen feel clean and simple. They set up an observation platform on a raised section of ground, so the senior leadership could watch what they expected to be a quick and one-sided conversation. Arkhan rode to the front of his soldiers. He held up a hand and they stopped. He looked across the valley at the enormous army facing him. Banners from 7 kingdoms, cavalry on the left and right, archers 3 rows deep behind the front line. He looked for a long time, the way a man looks at a problem he has already solved in his mind. Then he dismounted. He handed his horse to the soldier beside him. He walked forward alone, 20 steps past his own front line, and stood in the open space between the two armies. The valley went very quiet. Wind moved through the grass. 110,000 men on both sides held their breath. Arkhan stood still for a moment. He looked at the sky. He looked at the mountains on either side of the valley. He looked at the platform where the 7 kings and generals were watching him. He breathed in. The roar that came out of him was not like the one in the eastern valley. That one had been sharp and sudden, like a crack of lightning. This one was different. This one built slowly, rising from somewhere deep in the ground beneath his feet, traveling up through his body, gathering everything with it. Every year of training, every night of hunger, every morning of watching his people struggle, every memory of his father's sword above the fire, and it came out of him like a mountain deciding to speak. The effect was immediate and total. On the northern ridge, a rock formation the size of a large house fractured along its base and collapsed down the slope in a slow, grinding avalanche of stone. Enemy scouts who had been positioned near it ran without looking back. The sound of the falling rock mixed with the sound of the roar and became something that seemed to come from everywhere at once. 3 of the 7 generals on the observation platform lost their footing. One of them fell, not because the ground shook. Independent accounts confirmed the ground was still, but because something in the sound removed the certainty from their legs. It was as though their bodies made a decision without asking their minds first. On the eastern flank of the coalition army, a large section of soldiers, men who had been brought from a recently conquered territory and had not chosen to be there, set down their weapons and walked away from the formation. They did not run, they simply walked, calmly, as if they had somewhere better to be. Their own officers tried to call them back and found, strangely, that their voices did not seem to carry very far. The roar lasted for what witnesses later described as a very long time, though when compared, their descriptions ranged from 15 seconds to several minutes. Time, it seemed, had moved differently inside it. When it ended, Arkhan stood in the same place he had been standing before, completely still, not breathing hard, not shaking. He looked at the coalition army the way a teacher looks at students who have just understood a difficult lesson. The coalition army did not advance for 11 hours. By the time the generals finished their discussions and reorganized their formation, Arkhan's 10,000 soldiers had moved quietly and efficiently to control every pass, every water source, and every exit point in the valley. The 100,000 soldiers of the coalition were not surrounded, but they were in a position where advancing meant fighting uphill against men who knew every rock of the terrain, while their supply lines behind them ran through mountain passes, now held by mountain soldiers. The senior general of the coalition sent a messenger to Arkhan's camp that evening. The message said, "We would like to discuss terms." Over the next 3 months, 6 of the 7 kingdoms sent formal delegations to Arkhan's mountain court. They did not come to negotiate from strength. They came to ask how to be useful neighbors rather than future problems. Arkhan received each delegation the same way, with food on the table, calm conversation, and no mention of the Valley of Bones unless they brought it up first. His terms were simpler than they expected. No annual payments, no giving up of land, no public acknowledgement of what had happened. What he asked for was shared use of trade roads, agreements not to block water flow, and a rule that no future disputes between neighbors would be solved by sending soldiers before sending a message. "That is all?" the ambassador from the largest kingdom asked. "That is all," Arkhan said. "Peace is not complicated. Making it simple is the hard part." The 7th kingdom, the one that had led the coalition and designed the plan, was the last to send a representative. Their diplomat was an elderly man who had served 5 kings and negotiated 40 treaties. He arrived at Arkhan's court after a long journey, sat down at the offered table, and looked at the man across from him for a long time. "My king," the diplomat said finally, "asks me to tell you something. He says that in all his years, he has met men who win through force, men who win through cleverness, and men who win through patience. He has never met a man who wins through all 3 at once. He would like to stop being your opponent." Arkhan smiled, which by all accounts was something he did rarely enough that people remembered it when it happened. "Tell him I stopped thinking of him as an opponent the day his soldiers walked away from their weapons," he said. "A man who walks away from something unnecessary is already thinking clearly." That is the beginning of every good agreement. Those who served close to Arkan through the years that followed described a man who was different in private than the world imagined him. The world knew about the roar. The world knew about the mountains, and the coalition, and the Valley of Bones. What the world did not know was that he woke before his guards every morning and spent the first hour alone, looking out at whatever landscape was visible from wherever he was sleeping. He spoke softly in personal conversation. Visitors who had expected a thundering presence found instead that they had to lean in to hear him. He asked questions more often than he made statements. He remembered the names of children he had met once, years before. He kept a stone in his left hand during important meetings, a piece of gray rock he had picked up from the ground near the collapsed formation in the Valley of Bones. He turned it over and over between his fingers when he was thinking. When someone asked him about it once, he held it up and said, "This fell from something that seemed permanent." It is a reminder that nothing that seems permanent actually is, including problems. His closest advisor asked him once, in a private conversation that the advisor wrote down and preserved, what the roar actually felt like from the inside. Arkan thought about the question for a while before answering. "It does not feel like power," he said. "It feels like truth. When everything false falls away, all the noise and fear and performance, what is left is very loud." Arkan ruled the Unified Mountain Alliance for 31 years. In that time, no enemy kingdom launched a military action against his people. Several tried smaller tests, moving soldiers near borders, blocking a trade route for a season, sending aggressive letters. Each time, Arkan responded with a message and an invitation to talk. Each time, the test stopped. He never used the roar as a tool of politics. He never threatened to use it. He never mentioned it in negotiations. But people remembered. Kingdoms remembered. And memory, it turns out, is a powerful thing to have working in your favor. When he passed away in his 63rd year, after a short illness that he bore without complaint, his people did not build him a statue. This was his own instruction, given years before. He said statues made of stone were for men who were afraid they would be forgotten, and he had no interest in being remembered that way. What remained was something better than stone. In the Valley of Bones, where a mountain formation had collapsed, the day 100,000 soldiers decided not to advance, local people began calling the site by a different name. They called it the King's Echo. Parents took their children there and told them the story. Not to frighten them. To show them what was possible when a person committed fully to something true. In the archives of 3 separate enemy kingdoms, archives that were discovered in different centuries, in different locations, by researchers who had no knowledge of each other, historians found the same phrase written by different scribes from different eras, each describing the period of Arkan's rule. The phrase was this: "The mountains answered him." He was not a perfect man. He made decisions he later changed. He had nights of doubt that he shared with no one. He carried the memory of his father every day of his life, like a compass he could not set down. But he was a man who had discovered something that very few people ever find. He discovered that his deepest, most honest self, when fully expressed, was more powerful than any army. That the truth, when spoken with complete conviction, could move things that soldiers and swords could not. He shattered mountains. He terrified kingdoms. He unified his people, and he did it by being, in every moment that mattered, completely and fearlessly himself.